Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 18. And just a little catch-up on what happened in the last issue. Last time, we saw the final downfall of Nathan Ellery, the ex-leader of the Conclave, who we thought had died in issue 7, but apparently he just fell out of the window, got horribly maimed, and was able to, through the use of science, be put back together, and he was in a wheelchair, and he had some kind of breathing device, but other than that, he was still trying to be evil and whatnot. So he had captured Bolt and was torturing him, and he was trying to get Swamp Thing to come to them. And he and a doctor named Dr. Pretorius had come up with these things called E-waves that were going to erase the smarts of everybody. So when they use this, everybody in the world would become dumb except Nathan Ellery, and then he would become king. But unfortunately for him, Swamp Thing and Matt Cable and Abby show up and stop that from happening. And in the fight that ensued from that, Ellery's electric chair ended up going really close to some high voltage equipment, and he was accidentally electrocuted to death. And then they pretty much just leave the laboratory, and they leave Dr. Pretorius there to die, I guess, because he has to fight these robot dogs that they unleashed on Swamp Thing. But we see them surrounding Dr. Pretorius at the very end. So it seems like he's probably dead. And that's where we left off in the last issue. So first things first, with issue 18, we got the cover. We see Swamp Thing is bursting through a rock wall. And behind that rock wall are a couple demon-looking things, and they have their hands up shielding their eyes from the rocks that are flying at them. And on the ground, we see Abby Arcane is tied up, and she is in distress. Oh yeah, and I forgot that Matt Cable had stolen a helicopter at the end of the last issue, and everybody was on board with him, including Swamp Thing, and they were trying to fly off the island towards Florida. But unfortunately, the helicopter had a booby trap in it, which caused it to drop all of its fuel mid-flight. And last we saw, they were about to crash land. So as we turn to the first page, we see the smoking wreckage of the helicopter, and luckily they didn't crash in the ocean, they crashed in some swampy delta land. And it looks like Abby maybe got hurt a little bit in that crash because Matt is helping her walk, and Bolt is completely passed out as Swamp Thing has thrown him over his shoulder. And like I said, they're walking away from the wreckage, and as they do, the narration says, "Thick fingers of oily smoke curl upwards, reaching for the South Florida sky like the shaky grasp of a dying man. The shrill scream of twisting metal has faded now, and the damp Everglades air fills with gentler sounds. The rhythmic flap of an egret's wings, the low rustle of breeze-stirred grasses, and the lurching mud-slap stride of survivors." And we see Abby call back to Swamp Thing, who's got Bolt over his shoulder, and she's saying, "Easy with Bolt, Alec. He's in pretty bad shape." We see the name of this issue is Village of the Doomed, and it is written by David Michelini with art by Nestor Redondo. So as Swamp Thing and the others continue to walk through the swamp, Matt Cable says to Abby about Bolt, "He's lucky to be alive, Abby. We all are. If we hadn't been so close to this swamp when the blasted copter ran out of gas, we'd all be breathing salt water right now. Even so, But Matt cuts himself off right there because as they get to some more solid land, they notice that there's some kind of village ahead of them, and Matt says to the others, "Hey, looks like some kind of buildings up ahead. Probably just some hermit's hideaway, but at least it's shelter. Maybe we can..." But he's cut off once again as he is shocked by what he sees. And what he sees is a little village that kind of looks like It's a Small World After All or something from Disneyland, except there's a bunch of old people in the streets, and most of them are playing with children's toys. Some of them have like blocks and rattles and teddy bears. One of them has a candy cane in their mouth, and another one is riding a rocking horse. And over this panel, the narration says, "But as Lieutenant Matt Cable, Abigail Arcane, and the muck-draped mockery that was once Dr. Alec Holland stumble into the sun-washed clearing, it is not the expected promise of salvation that greets them, but rather a scene more reminiscent from some long-forgotten fairy tale gone mad." And as Swamp Thing sees this town and its residents, he thinks, "Lord!" And Abby exclaims, "Matt, what is it?" And Matt answers, "Beats me, Abby. It looks like some sort of geriatric Disneyland. But whatever it is, we'd better pray they take their medicine more seriously than their architecture." And as he's saying this, he's taking Bolt out of Swamp Thing's hands, and he's putting Bolt's limp body over his shoulders. And he says to Swamp Thing, "You wait here and keep out of sight, Alec. Soon as we make sure Bolt's going to be all right, we'll be back." And Swamp Thing stares at him and thinks, "You can come back if you want, Matt, but I'm afraid you won't find me waiting. No, You've shared enough of my pain, more than any lesser man would have endured. The only reason I hung around this long was because I thought you might need my help." And then Matt and Abby walk away, and Swamp Thing walks into the swamp waters, and he thinks, "But now, since you're in good hands." So it seems like he's just going to straight up leave them because he thinks that they are going to be okay in this village. But as Matt and Abby enter the village, we see a bunch of old people gather around and kind of stare at them. And Abby is freaked out, and she says, "Matt, I don't like it. Why are they just staring at us?" And Matt replies, "I don't know, Abby, but I intend to find out." And then he addresses all of the crowd around them, saying, "Hey, what's wrong with you people? Can't you see we've got an injured man here? We need some help." But instead of helping, the people just slowly begin to walk towards them, and the narration says, "But in answer, there was only silence along the storybook street. And then, slow smiles cracking their faces like open wombs, the aged crowd begins to shuffle forward, their filmy eyes hinting at emotions far darker than mercy. So as they shuffle towards Matt and Abby, they begin to threaten with what they have in their hands. So we see an old man with a cane and another one with a crutch, and they're raising it over their heads like they might strike Matt and Abby with them. And then there's an old woman who has a knitting needle, I guess, in her hand, and she's holding it threatening like she might stab at them. And the old people that don't have any weapons in their hands directly just pick up rocks. And of course, this frightens Abby and Matt, and Abby exclaims, "Oh my God, Matt, they look like they want to kill us." But just as it looked like the old people were going to attack, all of a sudden a young man walks into the crowd, and everybody kind of settles down. And this guy really stands out. He's got yellow pants and a yellow shirt, and the shirt is unbuttoned halfway down, so you can see most of his chest. He's got a silver medallion around his neck, and he is a red-headed white guy. And like I said, as he stepped into the crowd and approached Matt and Abby, everybody seemed to calm down a bit. They still have scowls on their faces, and he says condescendingly to Abby, "How now? No need to get excited, ma'am. They don't mean any harm. They're just a bit leery of strangers, that's all. I'm Aubrey Trask, and I'm, in charge around here." And he holds his hand out as if he wants to shake with them, but Matt and Abby just kind of stare at him, and then Matt replies, "We can discuss the reception committee later, Trask. This man needs medical attention now," referring to Bolt, who is still unconscious over his shoulder. And then Aubrey just smiles, and he waves towards one of the streets, and he says, "Sure thing, my friend. Just bring him this way. The infirmary's right down the block." Then we cut to inside the infirmary, and the narration says, "And soon, amid antiseptic surroundings, soothing ointments are applied, and curious explanations made." Then we see Aubrey Trask is talking to Matt and Abby, and he's saying, "That's right, Miss Arcane. This here's Serenity Village, the end product of 10 years of research. The backers say it's the ultimate in retirement facilities." And Abby asks, "But why does it look so bizarre?" And Aubrey answers, "Well, ma'am, it seems that somewhere along the line, someone figured a return to a childhood environment would ease the jolt of being put out to pasture. Serenity Village is the first practical test of that theory." And as Trask is talking, you can definitely tell by their body language that Matt and Abby, they're still not trusting of him, and they're still being cautious. And Matt doesn't even really care about this village at all, so he doesn't want to know about it. And he says, "We'd love to hear more about your project, Trask, later. Right now, our friend here needs a hospital." And Trask kind of pauses and smiles and says, "Right you are, Mr. Cable. I'll go phone for an ambulance straight away." Then we cut to Aubrey walking outside, and he's walking with an older woman, and she's saying, "Aubrey, why are you wasting time treating them young'uns' wounds? Where they're going, it won't matter none." And Aubrey replies, "Now, Marion, you know the procedure. They need to be at full strength. Why, if they were to die before the process was completed, we'd lose everything. Just be patient, Marion, and trust me." And she hesitantly says, "Well, all right, darling." And then just to make sure you know that's not like his mom or something, we get a really zoomed in panel of them kissing each other on the mouth. Then we cut to Swamp Thing in the swamps, and the narration says, "But May-December romances hold little interest for a certain mossy man-boot, for he has more somber thoughts to consider." And as he walks through the thigh-high waters, he thinks, "Louisiana, Florida, a swamp's still a swamp. I guess some things never..." But his thoughts are cut off as he turns and he sees some gravestones, and he thinks, a graveyard. Even here, my past won't let me be. Ever since those blasted experiments back in the bayou, all I've known is death. My wife, my friends, nothing but death. Death! Then he walks over to all the tombstones, and he begins punching at the biggest one, and he thinks, damn you, death! And then he picks up a chunk of the rubble from the ground, and he thinks, you leave me nothing but a future as cold and bleak as this stone. And then he drops the stone and he walks away from the smashed gravestone. And as he walks away, we see this weird little demon come out of nowhere and kind of stand on the rubble of the stones. It's crouched down and its body is all red, and it has 4 arms. And then the rest of its body kind of looks like a normal demon where it's got a tail and horns and stuff. So as it stares at Swamp Thing walking away, the narration says, lost in contemplation, the miry monster doesn't notice that the sanctuary of the quiet glade has been breached by another, a shadowy figure whose stealth guises thoughts far less melancholy than his own, but whose actions prove quite equally destructive. Then we see this demon thing spring onto Swamp Thing's back, and Swamp Thing turns just as it reaches him, and he thinks, what? But it's too late for him to really react, because the demon has wrapped its limbs around Swamp Thing's midsection, and is trying to latch onto him. And like I said earlier, it has 4 arms, so 2 of the arms are holding Swamp Thing's arms, and the other 2 are about ready to strike. And as Swamp Thing struggles, he thinks, don't know what this thing is, but it sure seems to have a first-class hate-on for big green monsters. Maybe this will give it something to think about. And with all his strength, Swamp Thing wrestles one of his arms free, and he punches the demon monster right in the face. And the monster staggers back from this, but then he recovers quickly, and he moves to attack again, and Swamp Thing thinks, swell, looks like tall, dark, and ugly won't take no for an answer. Guess I'll just have to try a less subtle form of discouragement. And with that, he grabs the demon monster by the neck, and they're still in the graveyard, so as he grabs it by the neck, he sees another tombstone right behind this demon, and he shoves it backwards onto it, and we hear a loud crack as the demon monster's back breaks. And with that, the body goes limp, and Swamp Thing leaves it on the ground, and you can tell by its face that it's definitely dead. And Swamp Thing looks at it and thinks, something tells me I'd best get back to that village, fast, because unless my slimy playmate here is an unlikely freak of nature, I've a feeling Matt Cable and friends are going to need my help after all. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the village inside of Bolt's infirmary room, and it seems like they've been waiting for a while because Matt says, I wonder what's been keeping the ambulance. Maybe I'd better, but he's cut off as Bolt actually gains consciousness and sits up and says, oh, what? Where? And at seeing Bolt awake, Abby exclaims, Bolt, you're all right. And Matt seems even more shocked by this because he says, but that's impossible. You were nearly dead. Your injuries, but he's cut off as someone finishes his sentence behind him saying, have healed quite satisfactory, Mr. Cable, thanks to our special potions. Then all 3 of them turn to see Aubrey Trask, and he is now wearing some kind of cloak, and he's holding a ceremonial-looking dagger, and he's flanked by a bunch of old male villagers that have daggers. And as he looks at them, he says, for you see, you're worth a great deal more to us alive than dead. After all, how can anyone sacrifice a corpse? Then we cut back to Swamp Thing, who's still walking around in the swamp. I guess he just figured that was a weird, monster he fought, and it was over. But all of a sudden, he hears a blood-curdling scream, and he turns and he thinks, a scream? God help me if I'm too late. So he rushes towards the sound, and the narration says, hurriedly, the root-tangled monstrosity crashes through the thin barrier of vines and rotting branches, only to breathe a gurgling sigh of relief as he finds it was not one of his hapless friends who had voiced that chill shriek of terror, though such knowledge is of little comfort to the man who did. So we see Swamp Thing come upon the scene of a man who just, I guess, parked around here, and he was walking outside, and one of those demon monsters is attacking him, and he's saying, help! Please! And the man is just saying that because there's no one really around. He doesn't see Swamp Thing peeking out of the bushes. And just as the monster is about to pounce, he yells, no! And then the monster jumps, But luckily for him, Swamp Thing was pretty close by because he dashes out of his hiding spot and grabs the monster by its tail, and he whips it into the car windshield. And as he does this, the narration says, "And then the threatening creature springs. Its tufted nostrils flare with the scent of death, only to find a split instant later that death was to be his own." And as Swamp Thing walks to the side of the car, he sees the demon monster has fallen out of the open driver's side door, and it is dead. And as Swamp Thing sees it, he thinks, "Seems like there are more monsters than mosquitoes in this swamp. But now, I'd best see if this one's intended victim needs any help." And he thinks help like that because the guy he just saved takes off, probably in fear because he thinks Swamp Thing is a new monster that's going to hurt him as well. So this guy runs into the village, and the streets are completely empty, so he goes to a building that says administration. And as he does, he's yelling, "Got to find someone! Get some help! But where? The administration office! They'll have a phone there!" So as he runs into the office, he sees someone sitting at a desk, but the chair is turned around. So he runs up to the man in the chair and says, "Hey, mister, you gotta call the police! There's monsters in the swamp! Do you hear there's—" But he cuts himself off as he spins the chair around, and he finds a corpse in the chair, and the narration says, "But the words die as the crazed man spins a well-oiled chair around, and faces a horror that makes the other grotesqueries he has witnessed this day grow pale in comparison. But mercifully, it is a sight that is cut painfully short." Then as the man stares at the corpse in shock, he gets hit over the head with some kind of metal pipe, and he passes out, and then he wakes up to Bolt, who's saying to him, "Welcome to Serenity Village, friend, better known as Bedlam." So it seems as the man was knocked out, he was brought to a room and chained to a wall where Matt, Abby, and Bolt are also chained, and Bolt's voice is what wakes him up, so he looks up and he stares at Bolt and he says, "Huh? But what?" And Matt answers, "If you're going to ask what's going on here, fella, we were hoping you could tell us." And then the man looks at Bolt and says, "But I don't know. My name is Nicholas Trask, and..." But at this revelation, Bolt cuts him off and says, "Trask? Then you're some kin to the head loony around here?" And Trask replies, "Loony? I don't understand. My parents are here. I was just coming to see them, but they're patients. I brought them here some months ago." And then he's cut off by a voice that says, "To live our lives as useless vegetables." Then we see Aubrey Trask enter the room, and he has a bunch of old people with him, and he now has a book in his hands and some sort of urn that has incense, and some of the old people are holding candles, but most of them just have their weapons. And as Nicholas Trask sees Aubrey, he says, "What? Father? But it can't be. You're over 70 years old." And Aubrey says, "That's right, Nicholas, I am. But you see, some of us old fogies resent being herded into some smelly swamp to die. We refuse to waste our last vital years playing checkers and sucking our gums. And so, we take up other interests. One of mine was the occult." And at that, he raises the book, and he kind of strokes its spine, and he continues, "Through methods you'd never comprehend, I obtained a copy of that dreaded book, the Ebon Tome, and a spell from its tainted pages has enabled us to regain lost youth by draining it from others." And Nicholas says, "Then, that man in the administration office," and Aubrey finishes his sentence saying, "was the real director of the village and the donor of my new prime. And with those monsters you spoke of, the results of a separate incantation, we will herd countless others here so that their years may become ours." And Nicholas asks, "But, Father, why?" And Aubrey answers, "Why? Have you ever tried living in a world where wrinkles are treated like the plague? Where at the magic age of 65, one's worth is turned off like a light switch? We're tired of having our lives controlled by young fools who just want us out of the way so they can take our place. And we're fighting back the only way we can." And then Aubrey smiles at the old woman at his side and he says, "We'll drain the men first, darling, and then the girl will be yours." And with that, Aubrey begins setting up for the ceremony. We see candles are burning, and like I said, there's an incense urn. And as he reads from the book, the narration says, "Dark candles are lit, and even darker words spoken. Vile phrases from a book spawned not in this world, as slowly the room fills with the acrid stench of sulfur, and a startling, unholy change begins. So as he reads from the book, the room gets all smoky, and we see the literal youth draining in real time out of Matt Cable, Bolt, and Nicholas Trask. Then we cut to outside where we see Swamp Thing is entering the town, and he thinks, everything looks peaceful enough. Now, if I can just find Cable and company without being... But his thoughts are cut off as some villager yells out, "Look, an outsider! Destroy him! He mustn't interfere!" Then we see 7 old people rush from a building, and they begin hitting Swamp Thing with their canes, and one of the women actually pulls off her heeled shoe and hits Swamp Thing with that, and as they do this, Swamp Thing thinks, "People, please, just go away. I don't want to hurt you." Then we cut back into the room where Aubrey Trask is doing the spell, and this time we're focused on Abby, because she was moved from the wall where everybody else was chained because they only want to drain the life of the men, and she was tied up from the ceiling with a rope around her wrists. So we see her staring at these knots, and her eyes are very wide, and the narration says, "While within the smoke-dimmed chamber, the horrible rites continue, as in a shadowed corner, unnoticed by a chanting throng, a strange glow frosts Abigail Arcane's upturned eyes, an icy light that shines to a most unusual effect." So as Abby stares, it seems like something supernatural is going on. We've kind of seen in the past issues that she definitely has some kind of sixth sense, maybe some telepathy, and it seems that might be true because the knots all of a sudden loosen and give way for no physical reason. Then we cut to Aubrey Trask still reading from the book, and the narration continues, "The throbbing chant builds, as unearned years are wrenched painfully from 3 unwilling subjects, riveting all eyes to the scene of that blasphemous transferal, until suddenly," then we see a hand reach out next to Aubrey, and it is Abby's hand, and she grabs the book and takes off, and one of the followers yells, "What? The girl? But how did she?" But Aubrey cuts him off yelling, "Never mind that! She's got the book! Get her!" And as Abby tries to rush out of the room, she is besieged by old people who grab at the book and try to stop her, and the narration says, "The lithe girl runs, but salvation seems foredoomed, for even with withered, brittle foes, there is strength in numbers." And one of the old people that has the best grip on the book says, "Come on, girlie, give!" And then the narration continues saying, "But then, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings, a beautiful head whirls round, and pale blue eyes gaze once more with an unknown radiance." So as Abby's head whips around and her eyes get very big and something supernatural happens, she says under her breath, Alec, help!" Then we cut to outside where Alec is still being beaten up by old people, and he's not hitting them because, he doesn't know what's going on, so he just thinks the old people are scared of him, and he's thinking, "I've battled werewolves, zombies, and demons, but how do you fight little old ladies without..." But his thoughts are cut off as all of a sudden he hears Abby's voice in his head yell, "Alec, help!" And that's how the motivation Swamp Thing needs to push these old people away. So he pushes an old woman down on the ground, which gives him enough room to break away from the old people and move towards the building he feels the telepathic call coming from. And as he does this, he thinks, "Sorry, folks, but playtime's over. Because in case you didn't hear, that was a scream for help, and it's help I'm going to give." And with that, Swamp Thing bursts through the wall of the building and into the room where Abby is being attacked and the others are being held. And as he does this, he just happens to run into the guy that grabbed the book from Abby, and this causes the old man to drop it on the ground, and Swamp Thing grabs hold of the old man's shoulder and thinks, "I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I can figure that out after I've..." But his thoughts are cut off as Abby points behind him and says, "Alec, look out for..." But she's cut off as Aubrey Trask runs over to the book, grabs it, and begins reading, saying, "Nimbos, Enacticos, Lazim, Bidar." Then we see the fire in the incense urn begin to flare up, and as it does, smoke comes out, and the narration says, "Heat swells the fetid air, as though the very gates of hell had burst open, as, with a hiss like a wounded serpent, the flickering brazier flames grow, unite, and attack." So we see from the flames of this incense brazier, a smoke begins to form above it, and the smoke forms a ghostly figure, where you can just see a face and some arms reaching out, and it moves to attack Swamp Thing, and it does this by shoving its ghostly arms through Swamp Thing's body. And as this happens, Swamp Thing thinks, this thing has no substance, can't get a hold of it, but it's not having any trouble doing a job on me. And then Abby yells to Swamp Thing, Alec, get the book! He's powerless without it! But every time Swamp Thing tries to move, this ghostly figure of smoke and flame blocks his way, and he thinks, no good. Can't get through this wall of fire. And we see Aubrey smile at this, and he says, I'm afraid it's all over, Miss Arcane. Your monstrous friend can't help you now. Then we hear a weak voice say, perhaps he can't, Father, but I can. And we see the aged body of Nicholas come into panel, and he grabs onto the book, and Aubrey turns and says, what? Nicholas, stop! You don't know what you're doing! You don't! But it's too late. Nicholas wrestles the book out of Aubrey's hands, and he throws it into the flames of the brazier, and the narration says, for a moment, the ancient book hangs suspended, floating amid the licking, hungering flames. And then, like a miniature nova, it swells to a violent globe of unnatural light, feeding on its own substance, taking the hideous flame-limbed demon with it, until there is nothing left but smoke and silence. And in the still of the aftermath, and we see everybody is kind of staring at this scene stunned. We see the youth has returned to Nicholas Trask along with Matt Cable and Bolt says, Cable, we're young again. The spell must have reversed itself when the book burned. And Nicholas says, yes, but what about Father? Then he moves towards the figure on the ground, and we see Aubrey Trask's old, limp body, and he's being cradled by his old lover, who says, he's dead, Nicholas. His heart couldn't take the strain of aging again. You've killed him. And Nicholas replies, no, Mother. His fear killed him. His fear of change. He couldn't understand that the old has to make way for the new, whether in seasons, ideas, or people. It's a fact of life, but one Father couldn't accept. And then he puts a hand on his mom's shoulder, and he says, I'm sorry, Mother, for you and for him. And she begins to cry. Then we see Abby free Matt Cable and Bolt from the wall they were chained to, and as they watch this scene take place between Nicholas and his mother, Bolt says, it's a sad world when Father has to fight son for survival, but at least it's over now. And Matt replies, not quite, Bolt. There's still the question of how Abby got out of those ropes by herself. And then he reaches out and puts his hand on Abby's shoulders and turns her towards him and says, and in fact, little lady, you've got quite a few questions to answer. And as soon as we get Alec to, huh? And as he looks to where Alec should be, Alec is gone and he says, blast, he's gone again. Then we get to Swamp Thing in the swamps, and as he walks along, the narration says, and a short distance away, a sad-eyed mockery shambles deeper into the clutching mire, his mind turned inwards to the doleful fate that he alone must bear, so that he doesn't notice the sheet of water-soaked newsprint that floats by in his wake. A bit of flotsam with a singularly disturbing headline. Then we get a zoomed-in panel of the newspaper that floats by, and we see the headline says, Monster Attacks Fort Lauderdale. So I guess we'll have to see what happens with that in the next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.